Welcome to the AI for Career Success video overview by Curt Robbins. We're experts at AI coaching and helping professionals like you and your employees upskill in AI. Right now, we are in the midst of an energy crisis on a scale we've never seen before. In fact, based on analysis of the International Energy Agency's latest report, experts are calling this the single largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The heart of the shock is the Strait of Hormuz. Nothing about this. 20% of the entire world's daily oil consumption passes through that one narrow choke point. And right now, those flows have ground to a near complete halt. As you can imagine, the result has been a surge in crude oil prices, now well over $100 a barrel, and that's sending shockwaves through the global economy. So, to really get a handle on this complex situation, we're going to break it down. We'll start by looking at the historic nature of this energy shock. Then, we'll dive into the IEA's emergency playbook and the long-term changes this crisis is likely to set in motion. After that, we'll consider a critical perspective on the IEA's role, and we'll wrap up with the key takeaways for you as a professional. All right, first up, let's look at the immediate impact. The whole thing was kicked off by a conflict in the Middle East that began on February 28, 2026. And its effect on that critical energy choke point was almost immediate, sparking a very rapid and very severe global response. The speed of this was just incredible. The conflict starts on February 28th, and just a few days later, a critical artery for global oil is basically tied off. By the middle of March, the economic pain is getting real, with prices for crude soaring past that $100 mark. And that's what forced the IEA to act, releasing its emergency report just 3 weeks after it all began. So what did the IEA do? Well, in response, they've not only coordinated a historic release of strategic oil reserves, they've also published an emergency playbook. This plan is all about practical, immediate measures that governments, businesses, and even households can take to cut oil demand and soften the economic blow. Now, the IEA's strategy really zeroes in on road transport. And there's a very clear reason for that. It makes up a massive 45% of all global oil use. So if you want to make a big, fast impact on demand, well, that's where you're going to start. The plan is essentially a toolkit of demand-side actions. It kicks off with behavioral changes, things like reducing commutes through remote work or using public transport. Then it moves into how we drive, suggesting things like lower speed limits to improve fuel economy. It also calls for cutting back on non-essential travel, especially business flights. And finally, optimizing how fuel gets used across industry and shipping. But this is about more than just short-term fixes. This crisis is really forcing a much broader reevaluation of our entire energy strategy. It's acting as a catalyst for some pretty profound long-term changes to the global energy system. And this leads us to a key insight from the analysis. The extreme volatility we're seeing with fossil fuels is making one thing crystal clear. For real energy security, nations have to speed up the transition to alternatives that they can actually control at home. This one driver, this search for stability, is kicking off a whole cascade of long-term changes. We're seeing a major push to diversify supply routes, a new sense of urgency for renewables and electrification, and a blunt acknowledgement that fossil fuel supply chains are just not reliable. And crucially, it's also letting a fire under R&D for sustainable fuels in really tough sectors, like aviation and shipping. Now, the IEA's report has not gone without some scrutiny. And this brings us to a critical perspective offered by analyst Richard Uhtred. In his March 22, 2026 column for Energy Policy Quarterly, he raises some important questions about the impartiality of the IEA itself. The fundamental question Uhtred puts on the table is this: does the IEA operate as a truly neutral international body? Or is its advice and how it frames these events influenced by specific geopolitical interests? The core of his critique really comes down to language. You can see a stark contrast in how the IEA has described different events. For the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the agency used very strong terms like invasion and weaponization. But for the current Middle East conflict, it uses much more neutral, passive phrasing like disruptions or simply the conflict. This all leads to Uhtred's conclusion that the IEA at its core was created back in 1974 as a political instrument, specifically a Western counterweight to OPEC. And so, he argues, its actions and its language really need to be understood within that historical and political context.
So, with all that said, what are the crucial strategic takeaways from this crisis for us as professionals and for our organizations? Well, the IEA report points out several major vulnerabilities, but the interesting thing is, these can also be seen as opportunities.
Let's look at how we can reframe these. You see a vulnerability like geopolitical price shocks? Well, that's actually an opportunity to accelerate the shift toward electric independence. Those fragile fossil fuel supply chains? That's the motivation to aggressively scale up renewables and electric vehicles. The gaps in sustainable fuels force a new focus on R&D for next-gen alternatives. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that the economic stress itself is the primary opportunity to build proactive resilience. Thank you for watching. This is where we teach you AI and help you get smarter than your competition. If you like these videos, use the QR code at the beginning of this video to buy us a coffee. Or hire us to coach you or your employees in AI. Please subscribe to the AI for Career Success YouTube channel and like, comment, and share to help us reach a wider audience.